I know very often in our understandings of living educational theory, the term standards of judgment come into it. Would you like to talk a little bit about standards of judgment in living educational theory, Jack?
Yeah, sure. It's a bit more complex to actually talk about a standard of judgment. And it's linked to something which is very important in terms of philosophy. So when you look at epistemology as the theory of knowledge, and there are other important areas of philosophy to do with ontology, you know, the theory of being, or axiology, theory of values. Now, in epistemology, you're actually faced with the idea of the theory of knowledge. How do you know that something that you're claiming is actually true? And it's testing the validity of a claim that an individual makes. Now, to test the validity of an explanation of educational influence, you need what are called standards of judgment. So a standard of judgment in terms of a claim to explain your educational influence would be one of the values that you use to explain your practice. I'll give you one example, that if freedom is denied and you value freedom, it may conflict with other values like justice, but sometimes freedom is denied when you believe you should be living it more fully. So you act to try to enhance the freedom, for example, of students to follow their own inquiries. So freedom becomes a standard of judgment in your claim to be explaining your educational influence. Now, this is really important, and it took me months to be clear about this importance of the standards of judgment. But those are the values that you use to actually judge whether or not something is an improvement. And each person has their own unique constellation of values that they use as their standards of judgment.
Okay, and so in a formal research process, then you would encourage students who are using a living educational theory approach to their research to continuously check that they are improving their practice, that they are living in the direction of their values, and that they would have standards of judgment by which they would evaluate this process.
Very much, Maureen. And this is something I really emphasize in living educational theory research, that in traditional research, researchers often leave it for months and months before they produce an explanation. Now, in living educational theory research, it is wise not to allow the data collection to go on for too long. I would say for longer than a month before you produce a draft explanation of your influence, because you suffer from what's called data overload. If you continue to gather data and you then don't produce a draft explanation, you honestly can get lost, you know, because you've got so much data. And then what people find it difficult sometimes to understand is that the draft you produce can then form the data which you can evaluate in the next iteration of your explanation. So you produce a draft explanation after, I would say, a month. You don't allow a month to go before you've actually shared a draft explanation as it's developed. But you then use the previous draft as data from which you can demonstrate that you're both improving your practice and your contribution to knowledge.
That sounds like really excellent advice, Jack.
Hmm.
And so would you see now, so would you see a correlation then between when people have, you know, drawn up their first iteration and they have, you know, used their standards of judgment to evaluate how their research is going, that they would then bring that into a second cycle? Would you see a correlation between living educational theory research and action research and that cyclical approach?
Very much so.
Mm.
That's where, for example, when you explain your educational influence, you produce a draft report. Now, with a validation group, you can actually be helped to evaluate the validity of your explanation. That then forms the next phase, because with validation groups, they often help you to see what's the next step. So as that evaluation, you actually use one evaluation to move you on to a redefinition of your concern, your imagination, what to do, your act, you evaluate. So that form of continuous action reflection cycle becomes, if you like, that way of life, that you're always involved in trying to improve your practice. And what you don't just do is to engage in those action reflection cycles, that you see how vital it is that you produce explanations, valid explanations of educational influence. And in the process, those action reflection cycles are very helpful.